Hello again. Today we're thinking about growing vegetables in raised beds, like these here. When I first came to this property about 25 years ago, I found that the soil was very heavy. It was a very clayey soil. At times that meant that the soil was sort of waterlogged during the winter. It was very difficult to work on during the early spring. It didn't drain very well. It was very difficult to grow the crops that I wanted. When I was walking on the soil, it would actually stick to my boots and my shoes, and I got in quite a mess. I decided that I needed to do something, and so I decided to put in raised beds instead. So I constructed a series of raised vegetable beds, and that meant that I could put new fresh topsoil, better topsoil, into the beds. I could improve the topsoil with my own homemade compost and various other things as well, which over the years has formed a nice growing medium for the crops to grow in. Growing in the raised beds, it means that you can actually work the soil much earlier in the year. It's much better drained. It doesn't ever get so wet and so cold as it would do if it was a natural clayey soil. It's much easier to use, much easier to work. I find that you can actually move around the outside of the raised beds. You can get into the middle of the bed and work in the middle of the bed without actually stepping onto the soil. You just go around the outside. If you need to, you can put large planks across to enable you to move from one side to the other. You don't ever have to get on the soil itself, so it doesn't get compacted. It's much easier to use. You can use it much earlier in the year. Now, these raised beds that we've got here are made out of substantial pieces of timber. Raised beds can be made yourself. You don't have to have a contractor to make a raised bed. They're not that difficult, but you need to make sure that you get the right materials. You can have much cheaper pieces of wood with less depth and everything, but they will soon rot, unfortunately. It's much better to invest in railway sleepers or substantial pieces of timber like this. If you lay out where you're going to put your raised beds, you can then just screw the timbers into place. Probably need to put in posts as well. Now I'm just going to show you what I've been doing over here. This is a very small raised bed which is going to go into the polytunnel to grow some carrots in. But the principle of making the raised beds is the same. And I'm just going to show how I've been making this particular one. So here we've got our pieces of timber and we are just screwing them together. You don't need a lot of very expensive tools. It's all very basic, really. So we're just putting some screws in to each of these holes here to hold the pieces of timber in place. And as I said, this small raised bed is going to go into the polytunnel to grow some nice early carrots. So let's just screw these into position. Okay, so if you have the basic tools and a little bit of knowledge, then it's quite easy to make some substantial raised beds which will last for many years and will give you lots of wonderful crops of vegetables. So once you've finished constructing your raised bed, you obviously need to get some topsoil to put in. And if possible, like myself, you will mix in your own homegrown compost as well. Now I'm just showing you a few of the things that you can actually add to improve the texture of your soil, to make your crops more productive. First one here that I'm showing you is homemade compost. I've got a large number of compost bins in which I produce homegrown compost. This particular compost, it's been rotting in the bins for several years. It's very, very well rotted now. So that's the first one that you can put onto your raised beds, home produced compost. A second type of compost that you can, a second type of additive that you can put onto your raised bed is composted chicken manure.
Oh.
Okay, so this is chicken manure pellets. These can be sprinkled on, and these will also produce very good nutrients as well. So that's a second one. A third one, here we have composted farmyard manure. Sometimes I will use actual farmyard manure that's well rotted, brought by a local farmer. Other times you can buy bags of composted farmyard manure like this, which again you can just sprinkle on to the soil. The last one that I've got here to show you is a very old form of organic fertiliser called blood, fish and bone. It may sound a little bit gruesome, but it's actually a very, very good thing to put onto the soil. It really will improve the fertility, and your crops will do much better when this sort of material is added. So these are four sorts of types of fertiliser that I would add to the soil to improve its fertility and its texture, and it would really help produce much better crops. When you've spread it out onto your soil, you don't have to put a huge amount on. If we're talking about the chicken manure pellets, for instance, you're spreading them on something like that, I suppose. When you've put it on, what I always do then is I just fork it in. So I'll actually just fork over. It's not proper digging, it's just lightly agitating the soil, just slightly digging it in like that. And always, after doing this, I would add water. I would water it in as well. If it's wet weather, that's fine. But if the weather is dry, then you do need to actually water the fertiliser in. Okay, so that's the sort of thing that I would put in to make the soil more productive. Once you have your raised beds prepared, you are then ready to start sowing and growing your crops. Today I'm going to be sowing some broad beans. You can actually see the broad beans there. They're broad beans that I saved myself last year. So I haven't actually bought these. These are ones that I kept to myself last season. So those are the broad beans. Now I've made a trench along here to put the broad beans in this particular raised bed. You can plant these in different ways. Some gardeners will simply put the broad bean onto the soil and push it down in like that. That's a perfectly acceptable way of doing it. Others will use a dibber to make holes. I myself like to have a trench like this. So I've got a trench about 3-4 inches deep, into which I'm now going to sow the seed. Because these seed are my own, that I kept myself, I've got lots, I can afford to actually put them in quite close together. If you were buying expensive seed, you'd be a little bit more careful about spacing them out. I'm just broadcasting these, just sowing them in quite thickly. If eventually this means that too many come up, I can easily just take some of the additional extra plants out when they are growing. So I'm just putting the seed into my trench. That should be about fine. Quite good. So what I'm going to do next then is I'm going to water them in. When planting seed, I always water in very well before closing the trench. So we're just going to water okay. So we've watered the beans, we've watered into the trench, and now we can just cover up. Just simply use a rake, rake the soil over. As simple as that. Always make sure that you mark the rows, can see here that I've actually sown several rows already this morning. I think I've sown about 6 rows. This was just the last one here that I was finishing off with. As it is still very much early springtime and the weather is still quite chilly, particularly at night, I am actually going to cover over with plastic. This will warm the soil and it will encourage the seed to germinate earlier. A lot of my raised beds at this time of the year, I will actually have plastic on top, and that should really encourage the seeds to grow. And before long we'll be seeing the seeds actually coming up. So that's planting broad bean seed in the raised beds.